Welcome to the Startup Grind.
All right, so without further ado, Adam, thank you for being here and having us at your awesome place. So let's get the show on the road. I'd like to start the interview by learning, and I think we all want to know about your background a little bit. Where did you grow up? Did you have any family influence? Was your father an entrepreneur, your grandfather? What made you go down this path?
Yeah, so I grew up in Orlando, Florida, spent 25 years there. My father is an entrepreneur. He owns he's done a lot of different things. He's always been kind of the mom and pop startup, never going to grow over a certain kind of phase. He's an entertainer, so he's owned a business booking entertainment in the Orlando area, which is obviously a great place to do that. But my father's done everything from marketing. He did marketing for a mall for a while. He set up Christmas decor in malls, which was a really random job to have when you're a teenager. But we'd go into malls at the end of the day and work until 8 a.m. when the mall opened. So when you're shopping for your Christmas stuff, you'd go into the mall end of October and there'd be nothing, and then the next day it'd be decorated for Christmas. We set up a mall one day on Halloween night, and that sucked. They were playing Christmas music over the mall speakers. So I kind of learned the entrepreneurial experience, in a sense, doing what you can for a buck from my dad. Ended up going to the University of Central Florida, really because I couldn't think of any other place that I wanted to go, and the university offered me more money than anywhere else. So actually, I think I got into UF, and I think they thought I was taking classes there for about a year because they kept sending me emails to sign up for classes. I think they just assumed that I got into the university, so why wouldn't I go to UF? But UCF paid me, as I said. But when I went into college, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I just knew that I wanted to work with startups, and I wouldn't even have defined startups like you do, like most people in the room would define a startup. I liked the idea of having like a defined impact on the bottom line of a company, and not being a cog in the wheel and not knowing the job that I did for the year, what impact it actually had on the business.
Perfect. So going back, when I sat down and spoke to you a few weeks ago, you mentioned going to UCF, and you were telling me about university startups that you worked with there. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So after my time at UCF, spent a year in Italy. It was awesome. Came back to the U.S. and started working for the university. A lot of universities have kind of university-style business incubators. Business incubators have been around forever. The Ben Craig Center is one here in Charlotte, and they've been around for 25, 26 years. The incubator at UCF is one of the leading incubators in the country. When I was there, they had about 100 active clients. So they had about 100 startups at 9 different locations all across the city. So I started working for a group that was kind of a sister organization to the incubator called the Venture Lab. The Venture Lab was started to help university professors spin out technology, really spin out technology into businesses. So one of the problems that you get at universities when you have really innovative technology, if it's not complete to a point where a company will come in and license it, there's nothing to do with it. So we were working with 2 professors on 3 different pieces of technology. 2 of them were centered, it was all optics technology. The university has a great optics school. So one of the professors had an innovative way to create an optical modulator. I do not have a technical background, I have a business background. I worked with a guy that had a PhD in optics, though. So I will try to remember his really dumbed down explanation. So if you know anything about optics, this probably won't make sense because it's probably inaccurate on some level. But optical modulators are little devices that sit in the backbone of the fiber optic network of the internet. Made by JDS Uniphase, that's one of the big companies that makes them. And they cost like $1,000 a pop. They're really expensive because they have a lithium niobate crystal in them. They have a crystal that just costs a lot to make. So this professor had innovated a way to make an optical modulator out of silicon. So it was theoretically like $10 to make or less, but the market, you could sell the thing for $1,000. So you can imagine the business model of, hey, we're gonna make this device for $10 and we can sell it for $950 and undercut the market and just dominate the market. But the professor had proven his technology on about the size of this table. So you can imagine a box this big, about that long, and equal depth. So he'd proven, all right, this thing works. Now I have to make it the size of like a cigarette box. And that process would take $5–10 million. And so you weren't going to get a company to come in and take this big box of stuff, spend years developing it to hopefully get to the point where you actually had a product. So we came in with the blessing somewhat of the university. We came in, we created a company, licensed that technology, and then we were going after government grants. So we approached DARPA. If you're not familiar with DARPA, any of the crazy crap that comes out of the military, DARPA funded it. Things like, I think I saw an RFQ for a flying Humvee that DARPA was putting like $20 million into somebody creating a flying Humvee. So we went after, for that and another use of that same technology, we went after about $10 million in DARPA grants. If you've never gone after a federal grant, don't. It's a horrible pain. It's a long process. We were actually awarded 2 grants for a total of about $9 million. So the goal was with that, it would take us about 2 years, we think, to develop it to a product. And then this was back in 2007, 2008, I think. So the federal government froze its budget, so they froze DARPA's budget, and so they canned all our projects because we hadn't received any cash yet. So we'd been awarded $9 million, and then the projects were scrapped, which kind of sucked. The real interesting thing about that tech, too, we found a study at the time. Intel was working on something really similar, and Intel had projected it was going to take them 10 years, and I think it was $100 or $500 million to develop, and to get to the proof of concept that this professor kind of already had. And granted, Intel couldn't go after it the same way because he'd locked it up in patents. But that was a really neat experience because it was kind of you'll see a lot of entrepreneurs that are like, I have this business, it's going to be $100 billion business in 5 years. And you just kind of laugh at them because it's just absurd. But this was a concept that's like, all right, well, if this actually works and the market's a $100 billion market, yeah, you can actually get 50, 60, 75% of the market in a couple of years. So it's a really cool concept, but just kind of failed from funding. The other technology we were working on was a solar technology, kind of a new way to create a solar cell. That one was a lot earlier, a little bit riskier. We kind of thought it would hit a certain price point, but that one kind of fizzled because the professor was a little bit nuts. That's the other downside of working on university technology. Professors are not business people. They are meant to be in laboratories generally. It's a broad generalization. So if you're a professor and that is not the case, I apologize. But the universities typically don't want professors to leave their posts to start companies, and professors typically don't want to because they have tenure usually, and so they have a guaranteed job. So that was the interesting little place we were trying to play in, was how do you take this tech that needs somebody to run it? Universities like to license technology but don't like to create businesses. So we walked kind of a thin line of vaguely blessed by the university businesses that were licensing university tech, and all of us were also paid by the university at the time. So it was interesting. We got some people that really hated us, that would yell at us for doing what we were doing, but we had a really good relationship with kind of like the head of the Office of Research. So every time somebody would yell at us, we'd go to him and he'd calm them down. So that was a fun experience. It didn't come to anything. All 3 of those businesses are basically defunct. But had a good time working on 3 really kind of innovative tech companies where I fundamentally didn't understand the technology, but knew it enough that I could figure out how to sell it.
Well, you said right there that you didn't think that none of the companies worked. but I'm sure where you are today and what you've learned, you've learned a lot from there. It's pretty fair to say. So after that, you're in Florida. You get a phone call, I want to say in early 2011, you told me, from Dan Roselli. He called you up about this place that we're all sitting at right now, Packard Place. Can you tell us kind of how that went down and what moved you up here?
Yeah, so I got married in 2009. My wife and I, when we got married, kind of knew we didn't want to end up in Orlando. Has anybody been to Orlando? Has anybody lived there? Okay, I'm not going to offend anybody. Great place to visit, terrible place to live. It's hot all the time, and everybody that's been there and hasn't lived there has been a tourist. People in Orlando hate tourists. Now, so my family's still in Orlando. I don't genuinely hate Orlando. We just kind of got sick of living in Florida. We both spent our whole lives there. So we started looking, found Charlotte, and really kind of fell in love with Charlotte. At the same time, literally actually our first time here in Charlotte was December 2010, and we stayed at the hotel right across the street and didn't notice this building like everybody didn't notice this building because it was just beige and awful. So we were staying in that hotel, I think the same week that Dan ended up closing on this building. Dan Roselli and his wife and business partner, Sarah Garces Roselli, they're entrepreneurs in Charlotte. They were looking for a physical location for one of their companies, but they were also looking for a way to support Charlotte entrepreneurs. So they found this building, pulled the trigger and bought it. They needed 15,000 square feet, and this is a 90,000 square foot building. So they bought Packard Place, had this high-level goal of making it a hub for entrepreneurs in town, figuring out what they could do to support entrepreneurs. So as they're kind of defining that goal, I'm kind of looking for an opportunity in Charlotte. Long-term goal of starting and running my own thing. Didn't want to move to a place and start something from scratch, not knowing anybody, because if anybody's ever tried to do that, I haven't, because I imagine it's awful. So I started meeting people in Charlotte and connected with Dan 3 days before he ended up posting the position for executive director, which is what I ended up taking. Was anybody here at the launch party for Packard Place in March 2010? Nice. So you people have been around for longer than I have. Although that night was my wife's birthday, so even if I was here, I wouldn't have been able to make it.
All right, so you just mentioned not knowing anybody, which I think is a problem that a lot of us might have had and maybe why a lot of us are here. So can you explain, besides that, what are some of the benefits of having a spot like Packard Place and what exactly people do here? I think there's a lot of people who aren't familiar with what goes on these additional floors above us and why an entrepreneur would want to come here as opposed to a traditional coffee shop.
Yeah. So networking, really important. Depending on your personality, kind of a pain. I'm an introvert, so I come to networking events, I enjoy them, but they exhaust me, and I just need to go home and be by myself, which is kind of the same personality my wife has, so at least she understands it. When I get home and I'm like, just leave me alone for a little bit. So the nice thing about being in a place like Packard, you have lots of opportunity to connect with people and network and meet other entrepreneurs, and we try to make it as natural as possible. So one of the things, we'll have a bunch of events like this. Juan's back there, that he hosts Pitch Breakfast, which is an event that happens here third Wednesday? Second Wednesday of every month. Great event, I'd recommend coming out to it. So there's a lot of big kind of public entrepreneurial events that happen in the space to make that really, really easy. So you just kind of come to work, walk downstairs to an event, and go back to work. We try to do everything we can to build an entrepreneurial community, both in the building and in Charlotte as a whole. So one of the things we're involved in is an organization called Up Global. If you're not familiar with it, I'd recommend checking it out. Up Global has a goal of supporting startup activity really across the world. I actually met the people that started StartupGrind at an Up Global event. So we participate in things like Up Global, and they run startup weekends, if you're familiar with Startup Weekend. So you have access to all those sorts of events through hubs like Packard Place. In addition to that, one of the things we tried to do really, really early on is we obviously have a very large building as a resource. None of us are really commercial real estate people. My background is not commercial real estate. The owners aren't in commercial real estate aside from the fact that they now own a large building downtown. So we didn't come at this thing from a commercial real estate perspective. So it's added, I think, a lot of value because entrepreneurs don't necessarily want to, talk to a leasing agent when they're trying to rent office space. It's led to some probably pretty stupid decisions, I'm sure, that we've made. But we took the building and said, what do entrepreneurs actually need? So we created what we call co-share space. It's a cross between co-working space and kind of business incubator space. About 25% of the building is that sort of space. So the space we're actually sitting in is part of the co-working space. So you can see if you look down that hallway, offices, the dark room behind you, the Queen City Forward room. We try to provide different types of space for entrepreneurs to set up shop and just make it as easy as possible to start a business. I like to say we try to facilitate rapid growth and success or early failure. Because one way or another, if you're going to fail, you want to get there as soon as possible so you can move on, and you want to make it as painless as possible. So we'll have entrepreneurs come in and set up shop literally in a day. And we have all the kind of infrastructure you need to have a real business running. And we try to make that as painless as possible. So it's little things like no down payments, no personal guarantees. It's like 15-day out. That's been really, really successful because I think it doesn't. Co-working is really popular, not so popular in Charlotte yet. So that's gone really well. If you look out, and I'm going to get in trouble because I know we have tenants in the building that I haven't put their logos on the wall yet. The wall out there, those are the portion of the companies that have been based in Packard Place in the last 3 years, and it kind of extends down the hallway, which I know most of you can't see. And it's, some of those companies were in the building for a month. Some of them have failed. Some of them have gone on, moved out of Charlotte. Some of them are really successful. So we've just done everything we can to kind of support those types of startups, both kind of physically and then in their development. We also facilitate 6 now accelerator programs. So programs geared around different types of entrepreneurship. 2 of the programs we run, and this might be on your list for later. 2 of the programs that we run, RevTech Labs and Queen City FinTech. Traditional kind of accelerator programs, think Techstars, but not as high class as Techstars. There's a program here for energy entrepreneurs called CLT Jewels. City Startup Labs focuses on kind of inner city men. Student ones, there's a bunch of names I'm going to forget, I'm sure. But we try to facilitate and allow those things to happen and help them to grow, pull from the same pools of mentors, and just try to make startup activity as easy as possible.
Perfect. Well, yeah, you kind of led me into my next question, and that was about RevTech Labs, which is something that you co-founded with Dan, the guy who hired you to come up here from Florida, which is the largest incubator outside, correct me if I'm wrong, outside of Boston, New York, in the Valley.
As far as we know.
As far as you know, that's good enough, so that's a fact. Can you tell all of us what an incubator is, an accelerator program, QC FinTech, to explain it for people who haven't heard of the word incubator accelerator program?
Yeah, so Dan and I still disagree on what an incubator and an accelerator is. So generally, I think there's a lot of confusion on the definitions of incubators and accelerators. So my definitions are not the definitions. So RevTech Labs was started 3 years ago, 2-3 years ago, to support tech startups in Charlotte. So it was really an initiative when we started it of kind of tech entrepreneurs in town. Got as much buy-in as we could and just kind of started running with it. It's an accelerator along the lines of Techstars. They're kind of really the flagship accelerator program in town, in the country. So what an accelerator like that will do is we'll put out a competitive application, so we'll accept applications from startups, typically looking for startups that are pre-revenue. Startups will, once they're accepted, they'll typically move into the space, actually have physical office space, If they're from outside of town, they'll physically move to Charlotte or wherever the accelerator is based. Most accelerators, ours included, is mentor driven. So one of the reasons entrepreneurs are coming into the program is to have access to mentors. We created, in our third round, we created a sister program to RevTech Labs called QC FinTech. Focuses on financial services technology. Obviously, we're in Charlotte. There's a lot of banking expertise here. And so really, when we get companies to move in from out of town for QC FinTech, it's because they have access to Bank of America and Wells Fargo, Experian, and others. Then most accelerators at the end have a demo day, so you give the entrepreneurs an opportunity to pitch in front of investors, and most entrepreneurs are trying to raise cash. So we've gone through 3 rounds of RevTech Labs. We're accepting applications for our 4th right now. Our 3rd round was our first where we really started accepting companies nationally. So our first 2 rounds, we had nothing but Charlotte startups. Our 3rd round, we only had 2, I believe, startups from Charlotte. We actually got 2 startups to move to Charlotte from Silicon Valley, 1 from New York, 1 from Boulder, 2 from Miami. We had 10 companies start the program, 1 dropped over the course of the program. For that round, we raised a 506c fund, which is a public fund from accredited investors. We raised about $160,000, split equally among the 9 companies. So we actually invested that cash into those companies. And the ultimate goal then is if the companies are really successful, we take a small portion of that. And so if we're lucky, the program might pay for itself. But for us, it's really been, we thought it would add value to Charlotte startups and the community. So we essentially run it, at a loss for 3 years and probably for the next couple. But I had a fortunate opportunity as we were starting the program. It was a little bit of a passion project when we were starting it. I was in Boulder for an event, and Brad Feld was a speaker at the event. So if you haven't heard of Brad Feld, he runs a venture capital firm called the Foundry Group, based out of Boulder, Colorado. Brad was one of the co-founders of Techstars. And so David Cohen came to Brad, I think it's David Cohen, I forget all these names.
That's right.
David Cohen came to Brad and said, hey, I want to start this accelerator program. They didn't really exist at the time. And the way Brad tells it, he's like, I committed to put $350,000 into it, just see if it would work. So he on a whim, threw $350,000 into something. Ended up being ridiculously successful. Honestly, can't think of any of the names off the top of my head of companies that have come out of it, but they've been tremendously successful. When we looked at accelerator programs nationally, we realized a lot of them are, to some extent, startup activity in the country is a little, there are too many accelerators to some extent. So a lot of the accelerators that exist don't make money. We kind of looked at it and said, all right, well, we're okay if it doesn't make money, but we want to add value to startups, and we think this is a really good way to do it. But that's also the reason we started QC FinTech, because we think on a national level, that's one place where we can genuinely compete. Because there's only a handful of financial services accelerators, and kind of the payments space is really, really popular right now. Just look at Apple Pay as an example of something that's just national level taking off. So we think by supporting those types of entrepreneurs in a city like Charlotte, we can help companies in a way that is kind of unique to Charlotte.
So you mentioned to me that your last application process with RevTech Labs, you had 160 startups apply, which you had to narrow it down to 10. How do you make that selection? What are you looking for? If we have any startups in here, entrepreneurs or people watching, what are you looking for specifically when you're trying to narrow that down?
So we're essentially looking for, one of the main things is entrepreneurs absolutely have to be coachable. If you've ever tried to work with somebody who is not manageable, is not coachable, you just bang your head against the wall for 9 months or 9 weeks, the length of the program.
Feels like 9 months.
Yeah. So that's the first thing we look for is a team that, when we say, or when a mentor says, you really need to consider this, they genuinely take that mentor's advice. They don't have to do everything the mentor says, but they have to be coachable. Idea is obviously really important. Essentially, it's kind of objective or subjective. We're looking for good ideas that we think have the capability of raising capital. Most of the companies, I'd say 9 out of 10 of the companies that are coming into the program are looking to raise cash. So we bring in the mentors that are involved in the program that want to be involved in the selection process. And all of our team has experience on the funding side of things. So Dan is an investor. One of the things I did in Orlando, which was random, we worked with the local angel groups. We actually ran the deal flow for an angel group for a couple of years. So in that, I saw 300 business plans. So I just kind of have learned that experience of what investors are generally looking for. So most of the people involved in the selection process have some experience in that. So we really evaluate the companies as if we were investing in the companies. It's super subjective. Investors look for different things. We also don't wait until we have all the applications and view them against each other. If we find a great company early on in the process, we'll go ahead and accept them, and there's one less spot that we have. So there's some risk in getting a great company at the end, but we've got some leeway on how many companies we accept in, so that's a low risk for us. But I'd say if you're looking to apply for a program, we do occasionally get the question, well, if I can get into a Y Combinator or a Techstars, why would I be interested in coming into RevTech Labs? And we typically say, if you can get into Y Combinator or Techstars, absolutely go to Y Combinator or Techstars. I would be happy to help you apply to those programs. Those programs take thousands of applications for every round and select, Techstars selects 10, Y Combinator selects 40 or 50, I think now. So if you can get into those programs, do it. It's going to be better than coming to our accelerator here in Charlotte. But there are so many companies that are great potential companies that don't get into those programs, and we're fine taking rejects from Techstars. So we have no problem with that. So if you're applying to these programs, I would say it's just like applying for angel funding. You want to be optimistic but be realistic. Don't come out and say we only need 10% of the market, and we get 10% of the market, and we're going to do $10 million in our second year. You have to be able to justify all of your assumptions. Be conscious of the types of companies that these programs select. If you have a business that needs to hit 100 million users before you bring in revenue, don't apply to a program that is fundamentally looking for companies that have real solid business models and early opportunity for revenue. I mean, you can kind of look at the companies that have gone through it and figure that out pretty quickly.
So coming in, what are the most common mistakes you see a lot of these entrepreneurs, these startups? What's the most common mistake, I guess, besides coachability, which you mentioned before, that you see them making?
So I think most entrepreneurs that I've met in my career, and I've always kind of worked with startups. I have some startups on the side. I'm sure we'll get to that. Most entrepreneurs, if there's a problem with the business, default to we need to raise capital. So met a bunch of entrepreneurs at my time at the incubator in Orlando who would come to us and say, we need $200,000 because we're short this year and we need that to get to the next point. And then we look at their numbers. One company in particular had like 2.1 million in revenue one year, and that dropped over like 2 years. And they said, hey, we need to raise $1 million to get this new product online. Kind of looked at all their numbers and like, no, you really just have to focus on selling this thing that you already have. So we went in, trained them on sales, and their revenue jumped by I think $1 million in the next year. So they had the cash and they didn't have to give up equity. The other thing is assuming raising. If you've raised before, you know how much of a pain in the butt it is to raise capital. If you haven't, you just assume it's going to be easier than it is. Because people are familiar with, Silicon Valley, you have a cup of coffee and somebody will write you a check, which can genuinely happen. It's not going to happen in Charlotte. It's not going to happen in most places outside of the Valley. Most people underestimate how much work it is to raise capital and how long it takes. So it's typically a full-time thing. for one of the team members. Let's see, other common mistakes. Every entrepreneur thinks their idea is like the best idea ever. It's one of the best traits of entrepreneurs is they're passionate, so they love their stuff. Be really conscious of taking advice from other people, and if people constantly tell you, and the joke we'll use is that your baby is ugly. Your business is your baby. If your business fundamentally isn't going to work, it's kind of an ugly baby. So getting really good advice and taking it. Garth over there, who, by the way, speaking next StartupGrind, and he's way more interesting than I am, co-founded a company with a guy named Chris Halligan. And Chris gives a talk about the failure of that company. And one of the points he brings up, and I'm sure it's online somewhere, one of the points he brings up is they got a lot of people saying, this is a great idea, we love it. But those people either weren't buyers or they weren't genuinely using it to the extent that they kind of said they would use it. It's kind of a caution of just because you're getting advice that people like your idea, make sure it's the right people, and really kind of try to validate that just because somebody says your idea is good or bad, validate that it's actually good or bad business. That's something we see a lot. Even I have that experience in starting my own businesses. Is I get, I know all the, you should make sure it's a good idea and not an ugly baby, and I'll still kind of go along the path of, gosh, I really, really like this, and then I'll talk to Dan or somebody else in town, and they'll be like, I don't think that's going to work. So try to be conscious of that as you're starting and running your things.
Cool. So when you have 9 startups all working together for 9 weeks, is there ever any tension? Is everybody, and Garth gave me the word the other day, cooperation? Are they co-opting? Are they working with each other? Is there any animosity? All entrepreneurs, we have egos. I think it's pretty fair to say at least a little bit of one. So do you ever see that, or is everybody pretty much working together, have the same ultimate goal when they're in RevTech Labs?
We haven't had any competitive companies yet, so there's very little infighting in that sense. I say technically they're going after the same investment dollars, but again, it's not. Generally, it's not. An investor looks at these 2 companies and will only fund one of them because they only have the cash for one. It usually doesn't work that way. I would say we've probably been pretty fortunate in that. We're a little more conscious of if we're going to connect a company with a mentor, and this is good for companies and mentors, you generally want to make sure they get along. So we try to provide really easy ways for mentors and companies to meet and make sure not only they have a skill set match, but a personality match. Because we have the occasional mentor who's really kind of difficult to get along with, and then startup founder who's also kind of full of himself. And when you put those 2 together, they butt heads and we have to go, solve problems. So we try to avoid that interpersonal conflict as much as possible. But I think we've been fortunate. We haven't had that many people really in conflict with each other. So.
Okay. So you have another startup. As you mentioned before, you went to Italy before moving up here to Charlotte. Spent some time out there, and I know the times that we have talked, you said that you really enjoy going out there. You have this new startup that you're working on, Vino Ltd. So if you could let us know a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, in typical startup founder fashion, we changed the name already.
Since last week?
So the company's called 2 Bottles Wine Company.
Okay.
We changed it pretty quickly. So this is a good example. For years, I knew I wanted to start a company, didn't know what my passion was. I'm good at budgeting. I like numbers. I don't want to start a finance company. And I'm not really, my background, I'm not the idea guy. I'm not the guy that's going to come up with, hey, this is a cool thing we should do. But through my experience living in Italy, I have a passion for the country. So I was looking for something to connect me back to Italy. And my wife and I also have a passion for wine. We like really cheap wine and we like good wine. We just don't typically buy really good wine. I'm not above drinking a bottle of $2 Chuck.
$2.99 now.
$2.99 Chuck. So we were looking for a business to start. Kind of hit on wine is something that we had a passion for, and so decided to follow that passion. So we've created, and we're in the process of setting up the details, a online wine retail business. So closest competitors you can think, wine.com is like the 800-pound gorilla in the space. We have no desire to really directly compete with wine.com. The smaller niche players that were more along the lines of, you can think Club W, if you've ever been to that site, Lot 18, Tasting Room, which is actually owned by Lot 18. So the basic pitch of the business, Italy is, and we're starting in Italy, not necessarily long-term limiting ourselves to that. Italy is the only country in the world where every single region produces its own wine. There's something like 21, 22 regions in Italy, and each region has its own grape and its own wines. Most Americans know Tuscany and maybe Piedmont and Sicily. And so the wines from those regions that are the best wines are really good, but they're really expensive. So our goal for the business is track down vineyards in the regions that aren't known outside of Italy. A lot of these vineyards aren't selling their wine outside of their little town, certainly not outside of Italy. So we are tracking down those vineyards, finding great wine that's half price of a Super Tuscan or a Barolo, or you name the really great expensive Italian wine. And so we're connecting with the vineyards, bringing their wine over directly, and then selling it online directly to consumers. There's some different kind of elements to the business model that we're still kind of working out the details on. One of the interesting things that the tasting room does that we're playing with a little bit, they take and rebottle wine and sell little tasting bottles and kind of use that to give wine profiles for people. So we're building the business model in such a way that we can do similar things, but not exactly that. And so we're planning our first trip. The real negative of the business is selling wine in the U.S. is awful. You have to deal with federal government, and you have to deal with laws in every single state, and they're all different. So shipping between states is just like the worst thing you could possibly imagine. But we're doing it because we have a passion for wine and we enjoy that, so it's worth figuring out the hard parts. But in a couple weeks, we're headed over and we're going to hit just as many vineyards as we can when we were there. We have a couple connections in Italy when I was there, but I did have nothing to do with wine, so I don't have those connections necessarily. But we were planning the trip thinking, gosh, if we hit 6 vineyards, that'd be great. In the last week, we've got interest from 20 vineyards, I think. Okay. The one vineyard we know we're going to bring product over from is a vineyard that's owned by the aunt of one of my good friends in Italy. And they did, I think, 3,000 to 5,000 bottles last year, which is an incredibly small volume. So when we bring their wine over, we can pretty much guarantee this is the first time this wine has been in the U.S., and these are the 1,000 bottles that will come from this vintage, which is really kind of cool, I think. So we're early in that process. We're about to bring in about $25,000 in really kind of early investment, and with that, hopefully prove the model, and then decide. We can kind of decide one way or another if we're going to really go after some equity investment, try to grow the thing. Club W is an example. They raised $3 million about a year ago. Or it's a business that we kind of could uniquely go one or two ways. We can really try to ramp it and grow it and raise some equity investment, or we could try to bootstrap it and really control it and grow it slowly over time. So the business is my wife, myself, and we have a third business partner who's up in New York. And we don't really know. We're still trying to figure that part out of the business yet. But the nice thing about doing what I do is, Dan, who is my boss here at Packard Place, knows what I'm doing and supports it. So it's not like working at, Bank of America, where if they find out you have a business on the side, you might get fired.
Or Jimmy John's, have you seen the non-compete clause? You can no longer be a delivery driver for anybody else if you work for Jimmy John's.
Really?
So, yes.
The PhD I worked with at UCF has a bunch of patents in his name, and he's got a degree in optics. So he was looking for a job with, like a Lockheed Martin. And all of the big engineering firms basically say anything you create, we own, independent of when you create it. And if you come in with patents, you have to give them up. So it's just crazy, the rules that these kinds of companies have.
Well, I think we're getting ready to have some time to jump into Q&A. And before that, I'd like to ask Adam if he has any advice for aspiring entrepreneurs or for startups. What would be the one piece of advice you would give? I know that's kind of a generalized question, but I'm sure you have something up your sleeve.
I'd say it's kind of two pieces of advice, but network as much as you can. There's so many opportunities that I've had because I've met people, and when you're networking, if you're just trying to meet somebody and looking for what you can get out of them, like it's just a terrible way to meet somebody. Try to go into those relationships without expectations. But I would say also take advantage of the resources that exist. And I don't specifically mean Packard Place. There are great resources in Charlotte for entrepreneurs. Events like this, things like Pitch Breakfast, the SBTDC, Big. There's a bunch of great organizations. If those names don't mean anything to you, come up to me after. Thanks. There's also there's an event that we facilitate once a quarter, and we put it on our meetup. That's just kind of an intro to the startup community. So if you don't know the resources that you can kind of take advantage of as an entrepreneur, come to that. And it's literally me or Dan standing up, giving little 5-minute spiels on every organization that you should know about. So if you're familiar with all these organizations, it's really boring. If you're not, if you're new to the community, you're new to starting up, it should be really informative. So I just recommend taking advantage of. There's a lot of these resources are free, so take advantage of them as much as possible. Worst case, you wasted some time, but especially if it's a free resource, it's not like you're wasting your cash. It's short of your time. So.
I want to present to Adam, and you can open it up here. We know you're a wine drinker.
Looks like alcohol.
It does, and I want to tell you, we were going to get you the Dom, but there was too many bottles. We wanted to get you something that was one of a kind. To thank you for being our first ever Charlotte StartupGrind inaugural speaker.
Got me a lot of wrapping paper.
So this is pretty exciting right here, guys. Watching Adam open this. You can thank my wife for wrapping it this tight. So we got some StartupGrind wine for him, one of one in existence. So
that's fantastic. Thank you.
Hey, that's a wrap, guys. Thank you very much. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks a lot.
Well.